Good evening, and welcome to the 2021 Ina Levine Annual Lecture at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. My name is Betsy Anthony, and I'm the Director of Visiting Scholar Programs at the museum's Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies. I'm delighted to begin this evening with a thank you to the William S. and Ina Levine Family Foundation, and in particular to its founder, Bill Levine, a former presidential appointee to the United States Holocaust Memorial Council, and a longtime friend and supporter of the museum and the Mandel Center. Programs like this one are due to the generosity of families like the Levines, and we appreciate their thoughtful support so much. Tonight's conversation will raise new questions for scholars in the field of Holocaust studies. By bringing digital methods to this history, including digital mapping, animations, and visualizations of key historical places, we can see traditional primary sources in a new light. Holocaust history is not a complete history. It is constantly evolving. Analog sources, while invaluable, only get us so far. With digital technology, we have an opportunity to further explore moments, individuals, and spaces. With each development, a bigger piece of the puzzle is revealed. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Lisa Leff, the director of the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, who will guide tonight's conversation. Welcome, Lisa.
Hi, Betsy, and thanks so much. To all our listeners out there, welcome to tonight's program. Let me encourage you to let us know where you're watching from by commenting in the live chat. And also, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat as we go along. We're going to be reserving some time at the end of tonight's program to address as many of your questions as we can get to. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Paul Jaskot. Hi, Paul.
Hi.
Paul is the Ina Levine Invitational Scholar at the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies. He's a professor of art history, and visual studies at Duke University, where he leads the Digital Art History and Visual Culture Research Lab, which you can see pictured here. Paul's research focuses on the relationship between politics and architecture in Germany, particularly in the Nazi era and during the Holocaust. He's authored, edited, and co-authored many works on this topic. He's also a founding member of the Holocaust Geography Collaborative, which is a collective of scholars who use digital methods to advance questions about the genocide of Europe's Jews. Tonight, we'll be talking with Paul about his work with digital tools, such as maps, models, and animations. We'll focus on how using these methods can help us better understand the dynamics of the German occupation of Krakow in particular, both for Nazi policies and for Jewish experiences. So let's get started. Paul, let's start with the invasion of Poland. We know that it meant that everything changed for the inhabitants of Poland at that time in September of 1939. But our conversation tonight focuses on the city of Krakow. How did it change with the invasion?
Well, first, I think we need to set the stage a bit to talk about the community itself of Krakow. Krakow, as you know, was a thriving city that had a vibrant Jewish community for centuries, and it had a rich culture and history. The Vistula River runs through it, and it wraps around this historic core, which is still there, a popular tourist attraction then and now. And it's dominated by the Wawel Castle, which you see on the screen here. A great, again, an historic structure that rises above the Vistula. The castle is, as they say, visited to this day and is even a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Now, this center, this historic city, really changed, of course, when the Germans came into Poland, when they marched into Poland in September of 1939. The city of Krakow came under German occupation. And with that German occupation, Krakow and the surrounding areas became this territory that was called the General Government. And that General Government was under the leadership of Hans Frank. And you see Hans Frank here on the walls of the Wawel. Frank really used the Wawel not only as an administrative center, so this was the capital of this territory known as the general government, but it was also a residence for him. So it always served both a political and a social function in this particular administration. Now, the territory of the general government was actually made up of 4 districts, one of which was District Krakow, and that was headed by a number 2 man in the administration under Frank, which was Otto von Wächter, and we'll come back to him later in the evening. At any rate, as you can see, it's a very complicated administration. It's a very large administration. But what is often surprising is that it was administration not only to manage things like the Nazi participation in the war, but it was also an administration that had a separate division simply for construction itself. And that's really what I'm interested in and want to zero in on today. In that sense, this part of Poland, while it was considered to be racially inferior, and Hitler never really imagined it as being part of the Germany itself, that is really seen as a colony to be exploited through economic resources and labor, Frank had bigger ambitions. For Frank, this construction office was not just about building for the war effort. It was also quite literally about building a German general government and a German Krakow, to Germanize it, as he would say in some of his documents. And in fact, in other of his documents, he uses words like Burg instead of castle, so the German word for castle, in order to avoid the Polish word Wawel. So in all these ways, it shows you that while it was about exploiting this territory and the city, it was also about building a kind of cultural presence there in a very different way.
So if this is about building a German colony, what did this mean for the Jewish residents of Krakow?
Well, of course, Jewish Poles in Krakow were immediately subject to various restrictions. They had to wear armbands. They had to register their housing. They were forced to do various kinds of labor and other duties. Of course, this was part of ghettoization throughout Europe, and Krakow was no different. That is to say, the ghetto itself did not come until March of 1941. In March of 1941, as you see here, the Germans began to force Jews to move into the ghetto. And in Krakow, they were forced to a district south of the Vistula River called Podgorze. And there was a particular section of Podgorze of about 320 dwellings that were mostly run-down buildings in which 15 to 20,000 Jews were forced to live. So the conditions were, of course, very bad, as we know, and very cramped. But I think also what's interesting is the way that this spatial reorganization of Krakow always had that cultural dimension for the Germans, that is of clearing one part of Krakow of Jews to make it more German, and that of making another part of Krakow more Jewish. And so what you can see is anti-Semitism and cultural goals and spatial goals were really always intersecting at these particular points.
So you're talking about construction, right? A lot of construction needed for both the war effort, but also just to make Krakow into the Nazi city that Hans Frank had in mind for it. But how does looking at like building and construction work help us understand the Holocaust better?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm sure that some of your viewers are surprised that an art historian is talking about this kind of topic. But we should always remember that it's well known that the Holocaust is a profoundly spatial experience. It happens in space, and that space is not only found space, that is the spaces of German occupation, but it's also built space. And that includes the entire built environment. And this built environment was literally needed in order to, in the case of a ghettoization, segregate populations, but it was also needed for all kinds of levels of the occupation itself. And in that sense, literally rebuilding the East, which was part of Nazi ambition, that rebuilding of the East was also, that it had to be done in space. And it had to be done by moving people through space and building in space. That meant that not only were there conscripted labor from the Polish Christian civilian population, for example, but also much Jewish forced labor was also used in order to build this space. Their goal was clearly to establish a Nazi presence in Krakow and throughout the general government itself. Now, we can see, if I may have this next image, thank you. We can see that by looking at all of the offices in Krakow of the Nazi government, we can see how this space really matters for the implementation of the Holocaust. This map here shows you places where the offices of the general government were in Krakow. And you can see there's some clustering in the upper left, which was the housing district, the residential district built up for the Germans. But it's really overall, you can see many different parts of the city. The historic core, and including the Wawel at the bottom of that image, were taken over and had a Nazi presence through the administration. In that sense, it's really a massive administrative effort that required thousands of people, but also required taking over buildings, so appropriating buildings, renovating buildings, and sometimes building new structures. We can see, for example, with the Wawel here, how that took place in one particular building. You're seeing an addition to the Wawel made by the Nazi administration, so by Frank and his administrators, and it's a part of the Wawel on the left, and it's highlighted in the 3D model on the right. The historic core of the building is in white, whereas the red and the orange are additions to the building made by the Nazi administration. And what's really key here is that Frank wanted to claim both the historical authority of this incredible, important structure, which he was claiming was Germanic, but he also wanted to make it modern. So using a kind of administrative form with that kind of stripped down look of that building on the left, that would be typical of other Nazi administrative buildings that you would see in Germany. And I should say that the Polish scholar Jacek Puklau has written quite a bit about this and other parts of this building, so I can refer you to his work. But at any rate, what's really important here is that we see how construction was part of the daily life of the Nazi elite. It was part of the administration takeover of the city, but it was also part of spatial policy. We should never forget that the Wawel was a site of exclusion. It excluded not only the Jewish population, but most of the Polish population as well, the Polish Christian population. So it was really using space, adapting space, and changing space that became part of the way that the entire system was put into place that allowed for the later genocide to take place.
Okay. Paul, remember I asked our viewers to type in where they're viewing from, and looks like we've got people from all over. Welcome to our viewers watching us from Gig Harbor, Washington, Durham, North Carolina, near you, Paul, Port Jefferson, New York, Houston, Belfast, Maine, Chicago, and Taos, New Mexico. We've also got international viewers tuning in, so hello to you in Halifax, Canada, Sydney, Australia, and Japan.
Wow.
So you've already shown us some of the digital map that you made. So I want to ask you about these tools. Why are you using digital tools instead of relying only on standard kinds of archival sources?
Right. I think that's a good question because it really has kind of two answers to it. On the one hand, digital methods are a way of extending more traditional analog sources. So we're looking at archives, administrative archives, we're looking at testimony, we're looking at photographs, we're looking at architectural plans. These are traditional sources, and our digital methods help us to explain them in a different way and expand them. But more importantly, by using digital methods with these sources and by thinking iteratively, that is, in multiple different versions of the digital, we really get to explore the sources in new ways and most profoundly come up with really new questions. One of the things that I think that the digital allows us to do, for example, is to scale up the question, because digital methods can allow you to use evidence at scale, so large bodies of evidence that would be really almost impossible, if not impossible, to deal with as just if you are an individual scholar. But digital technologies can help us to sort that information and raise new questions of it, but they can also help us visualize that in new ways. Important for us, for example, was the way that thinking through digital methods helps us to focus on the Jewish experience in a new way at the scale of occupation. Usually we think of Jewish experience from the individual testimony, and that's of course very important to preserve. But the scale, whenever we scale it up to 100, 1,000, a million, then we inevitably come at it from the point of view of the perpetrator. And we can try to think about digital methods as a way of preserving that Jewish perspective, even at that level of scale. Now, that requires a great deal of labor, and I have to say a great deal of expertise that is not only mine, but is part of a wonderful group of collaborators. It really does take a much broader range of scholars to really do this. So in our team, we have art historians, of course, we have historians, we have geographers, we have digital visualizers, we have data processors, we have people that know how to do data management, and this, by the way, is students, faculty, staff, and not only at Duke, but also with other even international institutions. So it's really drawing on the expertise of a wide variety of people in order to really ask these new and complex questions.
It's an incredibly exciting model for scholarship, and one that, you know, we always in the humanities tend to look with some envy at our colleagues in the sciences, and you're really taking on that kind of model for the humanities. Can you show us some examples of how your collaboration comes together, maybe by looking at a digital map?
Sure. I brought in two maps here that really help us to think about the built environment in, I think, a different way. So this is a map you're seeing here of all the forced labor in ghettos in occupied Europe. It was data that was pulled from the museum's Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos, Volume 2, and it's part of a team led by my colleague Ann Kelly Knowles and featuring myself and Annika Walka, another colleague at Washington University. What we did is we extracted data from the encyclopedia, and in this case, for example, sorted it by labor. Now, usually we think of labor and forced labor often in relationship to the armaments industry, but that's really a post-43, that is after Stalingrad, a post-43 question. But labor in the ghetto system is a little bit more complex and a little bit more diverse, I would say. And in this case, what really surprises us is the dominant presence of construction activity as forced labor activity. Now, why this, I think, gets to our key question here of looking at it from the perspective of Jewish experience is often we see ghetto maps at the system level as dots on the map, as ghettos, as what the Nazi perpetrator set into place. But in this sense, we're trying to extract the evidence from the point of view of, well, what did the Jews actually do? What was the Jewish population forced to participate in? And in this sense, we can see the actual activity that in some parts of occupied Europe, construction, for example, was a dominant part of Jewish experience. So we're able to ask of this map not what it does from the perpetrator's perspective, but how it might have impacted and raised questions geographically, spatially, about construction activity for Jewish experience in other parts of Europe. Now, we can also see this at the more local level. Here you see a map of District Krakow, and it's the same kind of sorting where you see construction labor. So these are ghetto sites that had construction forced labor activity versus other sites that did not. And what it does is it doesn't answer a question for us, but it raises a question. It says, what about those ghettos that did have construction? Are they related to specific kinds of, were they perhaps more related to agricultural forced labor that was used for the war effort? So it really allows us to try to think about Jewish experience and to try to ask questions and parse that in new ways. And for me, what's incredibly important is that it allows us to think about how the built environment was a crucial part of that Nazi empire building, so that we can see this intersection really always of those Nazi plans for occupation in the East, that is their policy, but it intersects in the built environment with Jewish experience. That is what Jews were actually forced to do.
So Paul, you've used this term built environment a few times. You know, for those of us who are not in architecture, can you tell us what this means exactly?
Well, built environment is a very common term in architectural history and urban planning. And really why I kind of insist on it is that often in architectural history, we think of the architect designed building, the skyscraper, for example, or the monumental building in Berlin. But those are really a very small part of the built environment. So when we say built environment, we mean not only architect designed buildings, but the entire manipulation of spaces that are really important for this activity. So in this case, for example, we can think about how it provides sites for scholars, not only looking at major structures, but also looking at this intersection of construction and empire building. Here, for example, on the screen, you see Jewish forced laborers building part of the Schindler factory. So you see that armaments work going on, but at the same time, the Jewish experience. And so we can start to see this as a very banal built environment, a factory, after all. We can see this as part of a broader spatial question. And in that sense, we can really talk about how the Germans thought about the entire environment as a way of displaying their power. That it was not only the kind of cultural glamour of the Wawel, but it was changing and manipulating the streets, the factories, the sheds. All of this was part of that greater ambition. And it seems to me that the Jews who were forced to participate in this activity, that was, of course, part of their punishment, part of that anti-Semitic goal of punishing them, that this is also something we want to capture. And we'll miss that if we think about only major buildings. But if we focus on construction, then we get to see that connection between that Jewish experience. And it's that complex connection that I think we can really build out of an analysis of the built environment, if you pardon me using that metaphor.
I get it. So, I mean, one of the things that your work really does is that it moves towards this integrated history, right? Where for the past few decades, we've been trying to put the history of the perpetrators and the history of Jewish victims into the same space. And this analysis really allows you to do that.
Well, it is interesting, but you use the term integrated history, Lisa. I would say the term is intersecting history, because for me, working from the built environment is really a way of preserving the independence of Jewish experience from Nazi policy. They intersect there, but they're, of course, radically different.
Yes, and you're able to preserve that asymmetry.
Yeah.
So traditional primary sources seem like they're still a really key part of your work. You look at photographs and diaries, for example. Let's take one of these to see how you work with them. Tell us about Helena Nelkin and her diary.
Helena Nelkin wrote a very famous diary. It's quite well known. She was a Polish Jew in Krakow. She was 15 when the Nazis walked into the city. And we know much of her experience from this diary she kept. It's really an extraordinary document that, as I say, many people have talked about. Now, in 1941, her mother, her father, and her brother were forced into the Krakow ghetto. And she wrote about working as a forced laborer. But for me, what's also quite compelling is she talked about the spaces of the ghetto and the spaces of Krakow on the whole as really a way of making sense of her experience. So it really was quite a kind of complicated spatial document. My student Brian Rush, for example, has identified 900 different spatial references in the diary itself. So it shows you the way that she's thinking through some of these basic aspects of occupation and ghettoization through her understanding of space. Now, having grown up in Krakow, Nelkin, of course, was familiar with the spaces that the Nazis took over. She was very familiar with the Wawel, for example, and she really thought about that, as I say, in relationship to her near experience. One time, for example, when she was allowed out of the ghetto in early 1941, you could still get passes to go out of the city, or you were also sometimes working outside of the ghetto, not the city, the ghetto. But one time when she was allowed out, she gave this quote, and she said, quote, "After these excursions into town, the ghetto seems even more unbearable to me," end quote. And what I like about this is not only that it's quite evocative of her feelings of exclusion, but that exclusion is a spatial exclusion, that she's thinking about the ways in which one set of buildings is lost and another kind of spatial experience has now been forced upon her.
Right. So I'm seeing now how the space is a way to think about both what Nazis were up to, but also these painful experiences for Jews.
Right. Right. And space for Nelkin is also a kind of memory of spaces as well, spaces that she has left behind or been forced to leave behind.
Right. We've got a comment, Paul, from one of our viewers, Susan, who writes, "I myself am from Krakow and a Holocaust survivor."
Oh, well.
Susan, so glad you're watching.
Yeah, really, it's so important, and Nelkin. One of the reasons I'm attracted to Nelkin is not only this provocative diary, but she too was a survivor, and I have to say, after the war, she became a very prominent art historian. So she's very close to my heart. But thank you for joining us.
So let's push forward with this line of analysis and keep talking about space. You've talked about the Wawel Castle and its importance. How did the experience of the Wawel change for Helena Nelkin?
Yeah, that's interesting because in her diary, she often references the Wawel, and again, it becomes this kind of memory. Of course, she's excluded from it because now it's quite literally a Nazi space. But at the same time, it was really important to her. The Wawel went from being a place that she could enjoy with her friends to a place that she could only remember, and a place that became associated with her oppression. I'm showing you a photograph from her diary on the right. And very sadly, it's taken just a few days before the Nazis marched into Krakow. And you could see how much she and her friends are enjoying that site. But on the left, you see the actual site of the Wawel as a construction site. That is something that it became as part of building up the Nazi ambition that we talked about a little bit earlier. So what I'm interested in is how, for example, these analog sources, photographs after all, how historical photographs help us to also think about the way that these spaces changed, but also how the spaces were important for both, in this case, the Krakow Jewish experience of Helena Nelkin, but also the building of the Nazi presence through this administrative structure. So the photos really raise different kinds of questions. They raise questions of construction. They raise questions of memory. Now, the Wawel is just one example of how the built environment of Krakow changed. Another was, of course, the gate itself. Here you see the gate of the ghetto, the very famous gate. And an especially striking also reference to this is thinking about how Helena Nelkin talks about her pre-ghetto houses. That is, there are quotes in her diary that are really relevant and I think quite poignant about how those previous buildings really mean something to her and allow her to think about her current experience. So she wrote, for example, in this quote here, "Inanimate objects are cruel in their unchanging existence. The street, the house, the garden, some of the furniture we left behind are all exactly the same. Only I am behind bars like a dog." Now, I'm really struck in this very heartrending quote, how she's using that former building, that building. The building is static, but she's changed, right? So it's the building that remains the kind of linchpin for her experience, but it's how she thinks about also the change in her experience. Of course, her new housing would have been radically different, cramped and terrible. She lived mostly in one room with her family, and even that was really. I mean, sometimes if you lived in one room, that you were lucky. So it was really quite a horrible existence.
And what was happening outside the ghetto walls? Like, how were the members of the German elite living?
Yeah, and that's why I think that Nelkin thinking about her experience of housing, it's not by chance. Of course, housing in the ghetto was one of your number one issues of making sure that you had adequate housing. But housing is also a topic we can build out from to think about also what was a priority to the Nazi elite. So part of the Nazi plan, for example, was to redesign Krakow, which included housing for 30 to 40,000 administrators, German administrators coming in. You're seeing part of a housing district, which was constructed. And again, I would point you to the work of Jacek Perklau, who's written about this. But this housing district was really meant to be a place that would allow this city to really have a very, very dominant German presence. And we can understand this also, though, on a personal level, if we turn back to the Wächters. So Otto von Wächter and his wife, Charlotte or Lotta, you see them here on the screen. Now, just to remind you, Otto Wächter was the governor of District Krakow. So he was the district of this kind of general district. And that also meant that he was responsible for setting up the Krakow ghetto. Now, as a member of the Nazi elite, Charlotte saw her home in Krakow. She says this in her daybook. She saw her home in Krakow as too cramped, as not elegant enough. And it's quite clear from her diary, and these sources are now available at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum archive. It's quite clear from her writing that she wants to set herself up as the kind of second couple in Krakow right after the Franks, so Hans Frank and his wife Brigitta. And so what happens is that Charlotte Wechter and Otto Wechter decide to build their own house, essentially a second Schloss, a second palace for themselves. And here you see photographs from Charlotte's own photo album. So these were photos she took. And this is the photographs of the construction site. And I would just point out how much it mimics those values that are important to the Wawel. That is, on a high promontory, overlooking the Vistula River, so that you could see this wonderful vista that you control behind you. Now, really, what's quite crucial here is to think about when these photographs were taken. Charlotte and Otto were thinking about their house in March of 1941. That's the date of these photographs. March of 1941 happens to be exactly the time when Otto Wechter, in his day job, was thinking about the housing of over 15,000 Jews. And so as he's constructing their housing in the ghetto, so too is he experiencing this other architectural site, which they labeled the Wartenburg and was designed by a high-end architect, that they're thinking about housing for themselves, but just as he's also planning housing for the Jews. And the point here is to say that housing is the node, housing is the factor of the built environment that brings us out to both of these stories that, of course, are radically different.
Mm-hmm. So I see now why you objected to calling this integrated and rather want to call it intersecting, right? Because in the same city, we've got Helena Nelkin, whose life is shrinking, and then the Wechters, whose lives are expanding as they're building a lavish home.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
If there are other people with questions out there, please type them into the live chat and we'll try to get to them at the end of our conversation. But I want to turn back now to the Nazis' larger plans and how your digital work helps us understand it. The Nazis wanted to redesign Krakow. You've told us this. How did that connect to their plan to persecute the Jews of Europe?
Right. I think and thank you for bringing us back to the digital here. I think that the digital methods help us to scale up that individual experience. Scaling up is a term we often use in digital humanities. And that means we can go from the individual building to the plan, even to the scale of the occupation itself, as we saw in the previous map on forced labor construction. And what we can do is to try to isolate these questions at each different scale. And the ideal quote unquote plan for Krakow by Hubert Ritter, that this plan that he designed was also part of thinking about the different scale of activity and the different way that German occupation was going to happen. But it's also a way of showing that their thinking about occupation was always relational. That is, Nazi plan of cultural ambition is clearly related also to anti-Semitic oppression. A quote from Ritter, I think, helps us to clarify this. Here you see it. This is from the published version of the plan. Quote, since with the Nazi plans, we can count on a total disappearance of the Jews, we can remain calm about their present position in the city. Later, the ghetto will be torn down and a new city quarter for housing will be built. First of all, I would point out this emphasis on housing, but I would also say what's important here is the way that Ritter is seeing these two populations very much in both spatial planning together, but also temporal planning in time, that these populations are going to be living together for a certain amount of time before the Nazis then are able to go forward with their policies of ridding any kind of German territory of a Jewish presence.
Yeah, so that's how you can see that these two ambitions are always related to one another, right? Transforming the city, but also the Holocaust. Mm. So how do you use digital tools to better understand these Nazi plans? Can you show us an animation?
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to talk about an animation that we built. It was designed by Davide Contiero, and it's an animation of Krakow, of Ritter's plan. So Ritter was this Leipzig architect who was called in to do this ideal plan of the city. And while the plan was never put into action, so they didn't rebuild this, it was really important for seeing their values and the way they scaled them up and the relationship between Nazi Krakow and also what they saw as Jewish Krakow. So if we could go to the animation, I could kind of walk you through this clip. What you're seeing, you're facing east. You see the Wawel across the Vistula on the upper left. You see the district of the ghetto on the right in Podgorza. And then in the foreground was this area that was going to be redesigned for this quote unquote Nazi ideal plan. Now, there are a few key changes that we're going to see. The plan was originally designed in 1940, but there were 3 different versions until its completion in mid-1941. There you see the first version of the plan. And that mid-1941, I just point out that that was after the ghetto was already instated. So it's really what we're talking about is a plan that simultaneously with ghettoization.
Why were those changes important?
Well, there's one particular area I'd like us to focus on. If I may have the next image. Thank you. This is the 3rd version of the plan. So this is the last version in mid-1941. And what you see in yellow are the changes that were made on this last version. And these were changes that we discovered actually through the digital visualization process. So they're not readily apparent just by looking at the photographs or the designs themselves. And as you can see in the upper right, there's a tower in the upper right. And that upper right corner became of great interest to us because we noticed how many changes there were to it over the planning process. That corner is where this ideal plan of a Nazi city intersects, of course, spatially with the ghetto, which is just right across the river and the canal. So it's really quite a crucial point in which anybody standing that tower would be able to see both the geometric regularity of the Nazi plan on one side, but also they could see literally into the ghetto and the spaces of the ghetto into the other.
So what did this change wind up meaning for the Germans and then also obviously for the Jews?
Well, for me, this conceptualization, really, it's a conceptualization of how this space was to be done, can be, I think, imagined or at least reimagined if we show another clip from the animation. This is, we're going up to the tower itself. And what we do, we're going to rise up the tower. So we're going up the tower and we're seeing the view from the tower. So here you're looking back at the ideal city. There you see the Wawel clearly on the horizon. And then on the right, you can see how prominent the ghetto is as well. And for me, what this does is it raises that question. If the ghetto was that prominent and that tower was so significant for that corner, what were they thinking in terms of putting that ideal Nazi city so close to this other city? Now, we know from Ritter it was eventually supposed to be wiped out or removed. But nevertheless, in the plan and at the moment of planning, these two are simultaneous, so that the tower both shows a dominant Nazi presence, but would also mark for the Jewish population their presence and be quite visible from the ghetto itself.
It's interesting hearing you talk about these animations. It makes me realize these are not just illustrating your findings. Making them is actually doing the research for you. It's how you get to your findings.
Yeah, and I'd really want to emphasize that because it's really in the process of making that we learn about these analog sources. We really couldn't see those plans in the detail, and we found things in the plans that we didn't realize until we had to, for example, put it into AutoCAD, which is a kind of traditional but very precise architectural rendering program. So in order to do that, we had to make decisions, and we realized aspects of the plan that we had not previously seen.
So another aspect of the plan that you talked about was the plan to reroute the Vistula River. Yeah. That sounds like a huge undertaking. Why would they do that? What was the goal?
Yeah. Hans Frank saw the working of the Vistula River from Warsaw down to Krakow as making it more economically productive. That is, he wanted to modernize the banks and make it a real corridor that would support the war effort. For the German city planning, though, it was also required at Krakow, and this is something we hadn't quite realized, because the regularity of those square blocks, they wouldn't fit in with the irregularity of the Vistula River itself. That is, the river got in the way of building. So the sections of the river highlighted here in the still, they had to be changed, and they had to be changed for the architectural plan. So that means already we're thinking about an economic agenda, we're thinking about a cultural agenda. Frank himself also wanted the banks of the river changed because it's right below the Wawel. So this is a site that he and the other Nazi elite could enjoy. But we should also remember there's also a political agenda here. It's not only a political agenda of exclusion, Helena Nelkin, in her diary, talks about seeing the Vistula. She was able to see it from a small hill that was part of the ghetto. And she talks about being separated from that crucial part of her Krakow experience. So it becomes a memory for her. But also it's referred to in another diary by Julius Feldman as a labor site, as a forced labor site. And we know from other documents that the Vistula River was a massively important site of both conscripted Polish Christian labor, but also Polish Jewish labor. Just one example, by the end of 1940, there were over 410 different labor sites along the Vistula. And of those, at least 10,000 workers were forced Jewish labor. So this was a way of punishing Jews, of politically fulfilling their anti-Semitic agenda, and at the same time of fulfilling an economic and a cultural agenda. They're not the same, but from the Vistula, from that change in the Vistula River, that question popped out at us, and we decided we really need to explore it in greater detail.
So you mentioned a second diary. Can you tell us about Julius Feldman and the diary he wrote?
Julius Feldman, another famous source. Here you see his diary on the screen and the photograph of him. It was also, he, like Nelkin, was only 15 when the Nazis marched into Poland. And sadly, though, unlike Nelkin, he did not survive the war. So he wrote this diary he started it in early 1943, and it just ends in mid-1943. And he was killed at some point after that as a 19-year-old man. But this diary is another one of these very evocative documents. And it's a document where he too is trying to make sense of this environment of ghettoization with his brother and his parents, and ghettoization through spaces. I should note that one of the things that kept him alive was working as part of forced labor construction industry. So here's a real example of someone who is part and parcel of that process that we've been talking about here. Now, he witnessed the Krakow ghetto going up, but he also witnessed several of the actions. And one action that's really quite evocative was this action in October of 1942. So it was a deportation action. By then, there were only about 12,000 Jews left in the ghetto. And Feldman really describes this moment. So it's October 28th, 1942, when he gets up with his parents and his brother, and they walk to the labor office on Józefinska Street. And this labor office, they needed to go there because either you got a new stamp or a new kind of permission to continue your forced labor activity, or you were going to be sent to your death in one of the death camps. So it was a sorting, and it was life or death. They didn't realize that actually the labor office was not going to be able to provide them with the sanctuary that they thought it did. But nevertheless, Feldman walks into the city, or walks into the ghetto, into this street. He describes it with its chaos. He loses his father. He tries to hide his mother. His mother is ultimately captured. He loses track of his brother. Ultimately, he is hiding in a workshop that his supervisor is at, and he and some of his fellow workers are at this workshop. And out of the windows and the cracks of the workshop, they're able to see these crowds on the street. The workshop is on the same street as the labor office. Able to see the crowds on the street. But what's also quite compelling is able to see this little triangle of land that is across the street from him, which is a little island, clearly an island of safety. It's where the Ordnungspolizei, or the Jewish police, where when they're trying to save someone, they pull them out of line and they put them on this island so that they don't get caught up in any of the deportation action. And Feldman describes this and is able to see this and able to think about this as part of this incredible chaos. And once he gets out of this workshop, he goes looking for his family, and of course, they're gone. Now, I should say there's of course, and this gets back to our digital question, there's no real historical photograph of this, and all what we have is descriptions. What you see here are two recent visualizations by colleagues of mine at the University of Padua. And it's going to be quite clear, these are not illustrations, right? These are not attempting to reconstruct. We're trying to keep it as abstract. It's not really meant to be realistic. But what we've done here is to try to think about the question that Feldman's diary really raises for us. That is the question of density and chaos. So what you see on the left is that triangle of land. And what you see there is with 10 people, these kind of ghost imagery. What you see on the right is that same spot with about 300 people in ghost imagery. So we're nowhere near the thousands of the people that may have been in this street at that time. But you begin to see the density and you begin to ask questions about, well, actually, how many people could fit in this street? What was possible? How was it possible to be saved by being anywhere near this island of land? These are questions we can't answer merely from the diary. They're questions, though, that the digital visualization and using it repeatedly, modeling it in different ways, they give us at least an ability to say what was possible or what are possible answers for this question of how many people, what proportion could be saved and what proportion were already doomed even before that action started in the morning.
And I was so struck by what you said about, this being an event that we have no visual record of otherwise, right? So this allows us to ask those questions when there's no other visual evidence for it. Yeah. What you've said about Julius Feldman and his diary, brings us back to that basic point, which is that the Holocaust was made up of millions of individual experiences. And when you make these visualizations, it allows us to ask new questions. Now, the questions we've been looking at tonight are all about Krakow, but as we come to an end here, I wanted to ask you about how digital methods can help us better understand the Holocaust even beyond this one city.
Yeah, certainly for us, Krakow is very important, but it is one part of this broader analysis of ghettoization. And of course, for me, also the analysis of the construction industry through occupation. But what I think was really crucial to remember about digital methods is you can get from the individual to the systemic in important ways. That is, if we have a database of 1 million people, that data still exists as one person. And that thinking about how that person is still preserved means that there's still a way of thinking systemically, but also not losing that individual. At the same time, it's also about thinking iteratively. That is, as I've been saying, about modeling. So we have to think about a variety of different methods and different approaches. Just as studying the Holocaust has always been about the wide variety of sources and new sources that we discover, the use of survivor testimony, for example, that has become such a dominant part of the field. When I first started, it was not a dominant part of the field. And so there was a new source. And thinking about these new sources, well, we would also want to use all of the possible digital methods, from mapping to visualization to modeling to textual analysis. So we're really trying to use everything here in order to come up with that rich and complex history, because that's, after all, what we are really after. The digital, in this sense, is creating new sources for us because it's asking new questions, such as, for example, the density of space and of the population in the Feldman diary. But it's also allowing us to think about and analyze the built environment as part of the Holocaust in new ways. That is, to think about it as part of this intersecting history in which you see individual stories, individual communities, individual cities, individual ghettos, also related to that broader system and system of both experience, but sadly also of genocide. And for me, that's a really powerful lesson and something that I've learned with my colleagues in doing this kind of work.
Paul, thank you so much. Are you ready to go to some live questions from our audience?
Sure.
Okay. Here's one from Mark. What seemed the most surprising insight that your work revealed to you and the team?
Yeah. I'm really going to answer that with two answers. One is that working on that animation, I have to say, look, I'm an architectural historian. I know how to read a plan. I know how to look at a photographic model. I thought I knew that model, but there were so many surprises that came out of building that animation where Davide, for example, he would come to me and say, well, this doesn't quite work. And I'm like, well, why doesn't it work? And I would see a detail in the model that I missed. And I only caught it because the animation requires that kind of precision. So in some senses, digital methods make you more precise about your sources. So that's one big surprise to me. But secondly, and I think this has to be emphasized, for me, what has extended through my work with the Holocaust Geography Collaborative, and especially my colleague Ann Kelly Knowles, is just how important the construction industry is to the Holocaust. I did not see it. 10, 15 years ago, before I started this work, I did not think of the construction industry as a linchpin of the Holocaust. Now I think of it as one of the most fundamental parts of that dual project of using Jewish forced labor to oppress them and ultimately to kill them, and at the same time, constructing a German future and maintaining a German military present. And it's through the digital work, through seeing a map, for example, that shows you that construction forced labor is all over the ghetto system. This was a surprise to me. I thought, well, maybe it's in some places or maybe it's just in the big cities. It's all over. And so those revelations, again, they're not answers. That doesn't tell you anything about the construction industry other than the construction industry is now a problem that we have to go research and figure out why was it so crucial and where was it crucial and when was it crucial. Those are Holocaust questions we need to answer.
You know, Paul, before I got to know you and your work so well this year, I always just thought of building Nazism as a kind of metaphor or symbol, but now I understand it's so much more than that.
Yeah, and you see this also when you look at testimony. For example, the importance of carrying cement or bricks. Cement and bricks are words that are all over survivor testimony. And what does that mean? Well, it means they were building. We just don't know what they were building or where they were building. But again, by focusing on their labor activity, so not thinking about what did they build. Well, they built the Schindler factory. That's looking at it from the perspective of Schindler. He might have saved quite a few people, but it's still from his perspective, the Schindler factory. Looking at what they actually did, carried cement, used bricks, built labor. That's looking at it from their perspective. And that's a different approach, a bottom-up approach to construction and the Holocaust.
Right. Okay, here's another question from Cynthia. She asks, how did the Jewish population recreate community spaces within the ghetto? Are there any detailed maps that outline the space and boundaries of the ghetto?
Thank you for that question. There are, again, some wonderful scholars, both in Poland and Germany, and also in the English-speaking world, have done work on the Krakow ghetto. And you can find maps, including a map at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum website on the Krakow ghetto. And it was divided in their various divisions. But I think your question actually points to also something that we haven't quite explored yet. And that is, how did the spaces of the ghetto, how did the Polish Jews themselves rethink the spaces of the ghetto? So there's one, again, a very evocative moment mentioned in both Helena Nelken's diary and in Julius Feldman's diary about Rosh Hashanah in 1942. So fall 1942, it's before the action of October 42. And both of them comment how the Jewish community is quite tense because they think there's going to be some kind of action, and it doesn't happen. And there's a celebration. And to me, what's really interesting is they say there's a celebration, and we went to the temple. But the only synagogue that was available to them was actually already outside of the ghetto. They'd moved the ghetto border the previous summer, and but I can't. And maybe this is just research we haven't done yet, and perhaps someone knows this. But I want to know, where did they go to synagogue? In fall of 1942, because clearly it might have been, of course, in the community building. There was a mutual aid building, again, on Josefinska Street. So there were many buildings, of course, within the ghetto that could be possible. But I haven't found exactly where that is yet. And I want to find that, because that, again, says that building was important for spiritual purposes. And that's something that we don't know yet. At least I don't know yet. And I'd like to include that as part of how we're thinking about spatial meaning and the meaning of the built environment for the Jewish community itself.
Yeah. We've got a question from a former Mandel Fellow, Edward. He asks, what did the Nazi plans for Krakow tell us about the dichotomy in Nazi ideology between the rural and the urban?
Yeah, that's also good in the sense that as some of you may well know, for example, Himmler had as a vision of the SS this idea of a kind of rural aristocracy that would take over parts of a successful German East that is after the war was victorious. There were Nazi spatial planners that were thinking about farming and how do you transfer a quote unquote Polish farm into a German farm. So the rural and the agricultural, which of course was so crucial for this area's economy, these became very, very important also for Nazi ideology. But I think what we have to remember here is that Krakow was special. There's a reason they didn't put the capital in Warsaw. Warsaw was too Polish. That is, it was a Polish city dominated by Christian and Jewish Poles, and it was the capital of Poland before the Nazis came in. Krakow, because of its late medieval, early modern connections with Germany, or the German-speaking world, I should say, that Krakow could be imagined as a German city. And precisely because of its historical architecture, it could be pictured as something that was more familiar. And so for them, it was not just an urban center, but it was an historically significant urban center. And there were dozens of other specific cities, Prague, of course, being another one that's very famous. Richard Nemec has worked on that, a colleague of mine in Switzerland. And these cities were special because they were going to be German cities that were also going to be German capitals. But in some senses, they were really thinking about them as kind of German capitals in almost a medieval sense. That is, they would be urban centers that were part of a really controlling an otherwise rural and German-dominated locality.
I've got a question that really widens the scope from Siddhartha. What is the history of using this kind of built environment to contain a population short of internment in camps?
That is something that we are definitely grappling with as we speak, in the sense that there's, of course, some wonderful, wonderful literature on ghettoization as not only a phenomenon that goes back centuries, but is also transcultural. That is, many different cultures have used spatial segregation. Well, the question is, what do you define as ghettoization, right? Spatial segregation of a specific social group that is also hierarchical, that is meant to be inferior. So there's a power dynamic, there's a spatial dynamic, and there's a social dynamic. That said, that's not the only part of ghettoization. One thing that we've discovered through our extraction of information from the encyclopedias, for example, is that we think of ghettoization as walled because we think of cities like Krakow. The majority of ghettos were not walled. The majority of ghettos were guarded or were designated Jewish districts. That was a ghetto, right? It was not an enclosed space. And so thinking about spatial segregation, and I think about my work teaching American architecture. We think about spatial segregation, redlining in major cities such as Chicago or New York, but also spatial segregation in the South, and those spatial hierarchies. And there are, while it's not the same as Nazi ghettoization, there's at least a much longer history in which we have to start taking seriously how space is active as a dominant force to control people and to impose a particular will. And that from my perspective, that if we don't take that part of the built environment seriously, then we're not really understanding the built environment.
Yeah. Here's a final question that comes to us from Caroline. Did the Nazis have plans to redesign other cities in Europe?
They absolutely did. There were over 40 designated, what were called so-called Hitler cities in Germany itself, Germany proper. The most famous are Berlin, Nuremberg, Munich, and places like that. But this designation was also extended to other parts of Nazi-occupied Europe, for example, Pressburg, or also Prague, of course, and Krakow, and Danzig or Gdansk. These were all considered to be now privileged cities. And what was going to happen was that they were going to align with Hitler's main post-war agenda. We have to remember this. What was Hitler's main post-war agenda? To rebuild Berlin and to focus on architecture. That was the post-war agenda. Once the war was over, they were going to build in Germany, and progressively also build these other German capitals. And so it's almost a Europe-wide phenomenon, and it has more and more. What's interesting in Nazi studies in this period, we're looking more and more about not only occupation coming from the wonderful work of scholars such as Niels Gutschau, but also thinking about affiliated countries, so Slovakia or building in Norway under occupation, or Finland or Spain. So other elements of fascism, and really it's becoming an important question where we're seeing that people are learning from each other, governments are learning from each other through this alignment of fascist politics, and often also with the alignment of the kind of racism that is embodied in those anti-Semitic measures of Nazi Germany.
So, Paul, I want to thank you. This has been a great conversation tonight, and I'm sorry that we have to draw it to a close.
Well, thank you, Lisa. It's really been a pleasure.
And it's been great having you here this whole year, Paul.
Yeah. I personally, of course, I want to thank you. I want to thank Betsy. I want to thank my wonderful fellows and colleagues at the Mandel Center. And I would be very remiss if I did not thank my collaborators, my project team, my Krakow project team, but also the Holocaust Geography Collaborative. And just for folks that might be interested, here are a few of the sources of the many scholars in Poland, Germany, United States, other parts of the globe that are working on some of these topics if you're interested. So I encourage you to go do further research.
And I hope everyone will. On behalf of the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, I want to again thank the William S. and Ina Levine Family Foundation, as well as its founder, Bill Levine, for their support. I also want to invite our viewers to learn more about the work of our center, including especially our annual fellowship program, in which we bring about 25 scholars each year to the museum to do research in our collections for extended periods. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We hope you'll join us again for future programs like this one. Have a great night.